Mech pilots, online. BattleTech manuals, online. Long-term memory, offline. All systems bungled. Initiating BungleTech podcast.
In our 20th deployment of BungleTech, my spheroid co-host Michael and I are honored to be joined by the creative director of BattleTech, Randall Bills, as we discuss Operation Reunification and the BattleTech narrative experience on the table. We as well take a moment to welcome a few new members to our clan in our extraordinary Proclamation segment. Discuss a spicy heat mistake Randall was making in the days of yore, and read a sample of deep curtains found in Empire alone. Snuggle up by the fire, MechWarriors, and join us in Randall's Corner.
Bonus objective. Extraordinary proclamation. Initiating.
Clan fellows, our glory grows. Based on the succinct brief I've received from our ever-dutiful Loremasters MagnumDanger and RetroLazer, today I bring news of our latest bounty. Dacus, you fought well, and it is at the advisement of our MechWarriors that you have been brought into our family as a Bondsperson. I know you will work hard in contributing to our glory. I am also enthralled by the news that we have a new technician that has joined our ranks. Sandman, your experience behind enemy lines in the inner sphere, gathering information while maintaining your Duke's King Crab, truly will be invaluable. We as well anticipate great acts of maintenance on our own, much more sophisticated clan machinery. And perhaps by the blood of Kerensky, you could as well educate us as to what it is with the inner sphere and their obsession over crab mechs. I digress. To both you, Eric, and you, Sandman, welcome to the clan.
This is Professor Michael presenting The Sphere We Live In. The Scourge of Death were a fanatical terrorist organization active throughout the Free World League in the late 27th century. Responsible for bombings, hijackings, and assassinations, it was a direct attack against the Merrick family that finally moved them to the top of SAFE's Most Wanted list. The subsequent crackdown led to the invasion of Regulus, which was ruled by the Salaj family, and who were believed to be the financiers behind the attacks. Many of the Salaj family were imprisoned, tried, and executed, though some fled to the magistracy of Canopus, where SAFE agents continued to track prominent ex-Regulans until active operations were suspended during the Merrick Civil War. The Scourge of Death's impact on Free World's culture, however, cannot be overstated. This can be seen both in the large security retinues for all Merricks and the popularity of Scourge iconography among fringe political parties and anarchist groups. Some conspiracy theorists even suggest that the Scourge of Death never stopped operating. It just changed tactics in its opposition to Merrick hegemony. After all, a number of Salaj names can still be found in SAFE records and target lists. Now you know about the sphere we live in.
Primary objective. Podcast topic segment. Initiating.
Hello everybody and welcome to episode 20 of BungleTech, a BattleTech podcast. It is a big day, everybody, and I'm honored to share this big day with my sensual co-host, Michael. Say hello, Michael.
Hello.
And the reason it's big, the reason it's huge, is we've had people that have breathed and ate BattleTech in the past, but we have never had anyone that truly bled BattleTech. Today, we are honored to be joined by Randall Bills from Catalyst Game Labs himself. Randall, welcome.
Hey, I am incredibly excited to be here, so thank you for having me on.
Well, honestly, I know our listeners are super excited to hear from you. So, for those rare listeners that don't know who you are, who hear the name, who hear the statement of you bleeding BattleTech and are confused, who the heck are you, man?
So I have been playing BattleTech since 1986. Kind of a long story short, I'm 14 years old. I, of course, have watched Spaceship Yamato and G-Force and the Robotech television series premieres in the US, and I go bananas for it, and it's the coolest thing ever. And I then happen to go to a game store and I see that second edition box set, and I'm like, but okay, it doesn't say Robotech, but it's obviously got the Robotech mechs on it. In fact, all these years later, I still like to tease Jordan about the fact that the STF symbol was right there on the Warhammer leg, right? He didn't even take that off. It took me like a month because I'm a poor 15-year-old boy doing paper routes, and it took me a month to convince myself to buy it. And so then I biked down with my best friends, Chad and Tony at the time, to Desert Hobbies in Tempe, Arizona, and bought the box, and we took it home and tore the cover off and immediately played a game and played it all wrong, but we just fell in love with it immediately. I've been playing ever since. And then through a whole other, which, we can get into later if you wish, very long sordid story that started with me just kind of running games at local game conventions, coordinating with what would have been the FACET demo agents at the time. Got to go to Gen Con and play games there and meet the people at the company. And then this is my moment where I always, always, always give a huge shout out to Brian Neistel. So he was the BattleTech line developer at the time. And if he had not given me the shot, I wouldn't be where I am now. And he, convinced him to give me a shot. And so I got hired to work more as a assistant line developer for all the lines that FASA was doing at the time in 1996. They were also doing Shadowrun and Earthdawn. BattleTech's my first and always the love of my life outside of my family. And they needed, BattleTech always needed more help than the other companies did. And so, I mean, we're coming up on 30 years now. It's hard to believe that I have worked professionally on BattleTech, and I've kind of wended my way through multiple companies because it's like any long successful product, it ends up being bought and sold by various companies. And like I said, I think they've tried to ditch me sometimes in some dark alley, but I always find my way back to the light, and I just can't say no to it. In fact, just this morning I was working on some new BattleTech stuff and getting some spec sheets in, and so it is still just this incredible gift that I have been able to do this thing that I just love so much, and have been able to connect with this community that I really, obviously we're all going to be super biased, but I'm on this tour thing that I'm doing, which I'm sure we'll talk about in a little bit. And I have been able to literally shake hands with, now I'm running 1,500 plus people across 4 continents and 7 countries, and I really do think we just have the coolest, best community of gamers.
So what's your official title and role as someone who is both editing things and going out and shaking hands on some sort of tour?
My title is creative director. I wear a million hats. So at any given moment, I'm doing social media. Despite what Rem says, I will still do social media. Sometimes she'll get upset at me because I'll show something I wasn't supposed to. Sorry, Ram. But I will go and do conventions. So I'll run conventions. I will do production. So I'm working with manufacturers directly. Like I said, I just got in a spec sheet price quote from one of our foreign manufacturers to start reviewing. I write. I have not been able to write fiction this last year very much at all, which has been very sad, just how busy I am in other things. But I've published, I think, about 10 novels plus who knows how many short stories for BattleTech, plus game design. So I wear a million different hats. And it's just the nature of, being involved in this industry for so long that I've gotten to that place that I can wear these hats, and what the company needs me to do, I can do.
So you mentioned the trials and tribulations of earning enough money from your paper route to buy BattleTech at first. And obviously, you said, you had lots of interest from stuff like Macross, Battleship Yamato. What really pulled you into BattleTech, and why the passion for the universe?
Ooh, yeah, what a great question. I think initially, on the surface, it's just giant stompy robots. I can remember I'd been at Fast Corporation for a couple of years, and one of the other game line developers just kind of threw up his hands and is like, I just don't get why BattleTech just, sells and sells and sells. And the rest of us are looking at him like, I don't understand how you cannot understand that it's just giant robots, right? Like, giant robots are perennially cool, and obviously they will wax and wane in popularity just like any genre does. Cyberpunk or horror western can track large scale trends of buying and making, movies that are made, and so on. But the gut reaction of the giant robot is fantastic, and that's absolutely what initially pulled me in. After that, the game, obviously I'd never played a game like it before, so it really kind of blew my mind. Maybe 6 months later, after I'd gotten the game and we were playing, I walk into the local game store, and there's a novel there, Decision at Thunder Rift, and I like pick it up, and I'd never seen a game novel before. This was a couple years before the Dragonlance novels would come out that would completely stamp onto the gaming consciousness that fiction is here and fiction is amazing. So this really was early cutting edge stuff that was happening. And I picked it up. I literally picked it up, and I didn't know what to do with it for a moment, because I'm just like, I don't understand what this is. It has the name BattleTech on it, but it's a novel. And I read the back of it, and I'm like, oh, and like I could just feel myself getting excited. And then I read that, and man, I must have read that trilogy probably a dozen times over my high school career.
Wow.
I mean, don't get me wrong, I love fantasy to death. I even love super hard science fiction. But BattleTech is really like World War II with a couple of magic things added. Like the jump ships, the ability to fold space. That is kind of one of those magical parts of it. Some of the way that the armor works is magical, but really it's like World War II. And so it's like, my father was in the Navy in World War II, so you had that connection, and it gave you ability to immediately be a part of the universe. It just was so easy to connect to, like you understood it. This is also around when Top Gun was like the biggest movie on the planet, right? And so you had this fighter pilot thing. And then in BattleTech, not only do you have the fighter pilots, but they're actually like modern day knights. So you get that, I'm a knight, and who doesn't want to be a knight and hold a sword and shield and stand up against evil? All these magnificent elements that are woven in here. They Jordan and Ross and those that created the original BattleTech setting really created something special here. And so all of that just pulled me in. And then what's kept me is that, just from the reader standpoint, is all of these wonderful creative authors and artists that have contributed, hundreds and hundreds of, probably thousands by now, that have brought their vision to the table and have then, folded that vision into what is BattleTech. That to me is exciting. And then so applies on the creative side. Like the thing that I love most about the job that I do is when I get to sit at a table with a whole bunch of creatives we all then become greater than the sum of our parts, right? Like we create something truly new and special and different that none of us just by ourselves would have come up with, and then you're playing off that. Every 3 to 4 years, the owners of the company and I and the biggest the BattleTech line developers and Ray and Aaron, and then the biggest of the authors, Mike Stackpole, and then up and coming Brian and Michael Ciravella and others. We all get together in a room for literally like 18-hour days for like 3 or 4 days, with maps all over the wall and stacks of books everywhere, and just brainstorm to our heart's content until we figure out where the plot is going to go. That is just magical to me, to be able to sit with good friends that are wonderfully creative, just get to let our imaginations roar as loud as we can, and then we fit the various rough edges together and smooth it out. And then, across the years, I then get to sit down and watch a wonderful community joy at their tables what we've been able to put together. That sine wave back and forth between creatives and the community, like that's what's kept me energized and going, and as you said, bleeding for nearly 30 years, because that is just magnificent to me. That's everything that is worthwhile.
That's super cool to hear, because talking about that process of basically writing out the story for BattleTech, that reminds me more of what you would see in like a role-playing game property. That reminds me more of Shadowrun has periodic splat books with how the setting is advancing and stuff. And to drive a war game in that same way, not from the sense of we've got this new line of minis, how do we jam these into the overall story, but starting from the narrative is a huge part. It's a core part, and it always has been for BattleTech.
Oh, absolutely. I completely agree. One of the things, so my oldest, once again, I'm incredibly blessed that my family has been here, bleeding, so to speak, through all this together. So my oldest son works with Catalyst. He's my main springboard for ideas. He's currently the Leviathan's line developer, which is another minis game coming out this fall. When COVID started, we're like, I guess we're not sure what's gonna happen, right? Like the company gonna need to slow down? What are we gonna do? He's living with us at the time, so suddenly we had a lot of hours on our hands, and we decided to become tabletop miniature experts. We've always loved playing them, but the spread of our play has never been super massive, and so we decided to do that. So I might take a photo maybe and share. I've shared on social media before. I now have just walls and walls. I think we're over 100 unique games that we have played, and there are many of them that are amazing, right? Like there's just some fantastic games out there. That's another part that I love. I'm an equal opportunity gamer. I love all types of games. I love playing all types of games. I love both from a fan standpoint, but also from the development side. When I find a game that I'm like, oh my gosh, I've never thought about pairing these elements together. But every time we then sit, and of course I love spreadsheets. My children have literally joked that my burial tombstone will have an unfinished spreadsheet on it because I just love them to death. And we will take all the data that we've learned and plug it into these big spreadsheets. And then you look at trends, like, okay, how often is this type of game mechanic work? How often is the narrative used? And every time we do that, we realize we have to set BattleTech aside because it always breaks all the rules. And what I mean by that is that BattleTech it's a tabletop miniature game, except it's not completely one. Or it's a role-playing game where it's not completely one, meaning, yes, there is a role-playing game with it, but even if no one ever actually touches the role-playing game, they're at the table, if that makes sense. And yet it even has kind of like some board game elements to it. And so that's, I think, a key element of why BattleTech has survived. Now, to be clear, it's had its ups and its downs. 10 to 15 years ago, it absolutely was on a down slope, down in the trough. We were working on it. We were publishing, but it was, we kind of call it the dark days, so to speak. But what has allowed it to survive all that time is those unique elements, that it is narrative driven. It does bring a role-playing game flavor to it. I like to say that every roll of the dice, a story happens.
Yeah.
And there's not a lot of tabletop miniature games that do that. Again, I'm not trying to talk bad about other tabletop miniature games. Again, I've got a wall of them. I love them. I know so many of the developers and publishers out there. We talk. That's super good. There's something about the way BattleTech was structured that allows it to easily tell a story at the table, even when you're not trying to tell a story at the table.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just magic. That's something really unique.
Yeah, and I think that's something that, like, Nathan, that's a huge part of why you like this. You love that. I always sort of do a bit of that in pretty much any game I'm playing, but you in particular, Nathan, you need that narrative backing.
Yeah, I think, as an innate performer,
Yep.
I just can't shut up. And I got to dramatize stuff. And so I'm always, in my theater of the mind. And, BattleTech really paints that picture. But I want to jump to the Reunification tour, because we're talking about community. And this is a big thing you are doing to engage with the community. As a matter of fact, that's where we met and had the conversation to get you on the podcast. So
yeah, up at the Sentry Box.
What is the Operation Reunification World Tour, Randall?
So last fall, I was heading over to Germany to the Essen Game Fair, which is one of the biggest game fairs in the world. And I had been talking to my boss, and at that point, we were 6 months past, or maybe 5 months past, when we had the Insane Mercenaries Kickstarter. We'd broken into the top 20 Kickstarters of all time. And I was just feeling so grateful, right? Like knowing that we would not be here without the community. I never want to forget that. I don't think I ever do. I don't think Catalyst does. That the community is everything. And the Europeans in particular, now there's other parts of the world as well, but there's a very strong BattleTech contingent in Europe, and especially in Germany, that don't get the love like the Americans do, because the Americans just have a lot more opportunities to come to conventions to see us, because we're at a lot of conventions. Whereas Europeans just don't travel as much. So even though I go over to Essen every year, if you're on the east side of Germany, then the odds of you getting to Essen are pretty low. And so I told Lauren, I'm like, you know what? I'm gonna go out a couple of days early. I'm gonna fly out to a store or two on the east side and play, right? And sit down at their tables.
Have
just
some games.
Just exactly, just to thank them. And so I reached out to them, and they're like, we'd love to have you. And so literally just dropped into the store, sat down, played with them. One of the stores only had 8 people in it. Still a blast. The other one actually had the other one, which was at a tiny little town. So I was thinking, oh, maybe we'll get 4 people there, right? And there ended up being I think 15 or 16. and it was glorious, because once they got over the fact that I'm one of the creatives that works on this game that they love, then we're all just people who are gamers that love this game. And just the gratitude that I was willing to go out of my way to get there, to sit down at their tables, not go, hey, you meet me at my table. No, I went to their table. And that was just so good that I came away of that thinking, we have this unique opportunity here where BattleTech right now definitively is selling better and is being played more than ever in its entire history. It's the 40th anniversary of the game this year. The Kickstarter is delivering this year. We could turn this into something really special that players will remember for years and years and years to come. And along the way, we'll actually get a lot of good information as well, right? One of the things that I love is seeing how players interact at the table. What do they actually do when they're playing? How do they use the dice? Do they want more dice? Do they want less dice? What type of train do they use, right? So I've also got the business hat on there as well. And Lauren was a little unconvinced initially, So I just did it, the first leg. And luckily, coming out of Adepticon, he was able to drive up with me to a store, and we spent the whole evening, again, just talking to them, laughing, having a good time, signing books, talking to them about the games, taking photos of all the material that they put together and use and how they do it and how they interact. And as we're leaving, Lauren was like, okay, I get it. And so then that kind of, okay, well, then I'm just going to keep doing it. And, you can tell me stop when I get too crazy. And so then, this last one, I'm currently in the short third leg, which is I was just down in Salt Lake last weekend. And then I will head down to do like a Phoenix, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, San Diego right before San Diego Comic-Con, and then fly up to Gen Con. So it's kind of a short leg. But before that, I did like a 6-week insanity that had me going out to starting in Europe for 4 weeks. I hit like a dozen stores in 5 different countries, and then flew over to Western Canada, which is where I met up with you at the Sentry Box. And then literally this morning, I was starting to pen in another insane month for a fourth leg that'll have me going back to Europe and maybe even wrapping the globe back down to Australia, New Zealand, which I've never been to. And again, it's all kind of insane. And it's a lot of work and effort. And I don't get nearly as much work done as I'm able to just because so much traveling going on. But it still feels like we're in this incredible moment where personally and then Catalyst itself can give back to this community, can sit at their tables and thank them and let them know that we wouldn't be here without them, and how amazing it is that we have this shared community that supports and loves each other. And that's just fantastic to me. I've been doing this for a very long time, and even this trip has been eye-opening at how amazing gamers can be, how fantastic it is to sit in a game store and watching the people come in and the support that they provide. Like in one of the places, I'm in a tiny town in the east coast of the UK, and one of the guys was delayed a lot getting there. And so we got it there like right before I was about to leave, and it was like 10 o'clock at night. We got in a handshake and some photos and got some fun talking. But then immediately the guys are like, no, we'll get a bed set up in the back and you'll be taken care of tonight and we'll get you out tomorrow. Like it wasn't even a thing,
Nice.
right? That's such a small thing, but to me, that's part of what makes it all amazing and fantastic, is that generally speaking, most of my experience, and certainly on this trip, has been that we are an amazing community of people that just love doing what we're doing, and we support each other. And yeah, I could just go on and on, as you can tell.
So as you're planning this event, you want to go out, you want to share the love, you want to experience all the wonderful kindness of the BattleTech community. So you're picking a name and you decide to call it the Reunification Tour, hearkening to one of the biggest distributions of love in the BattleTech
Comstar
lore.
love, yeah.
So it was really funny. We were trying to find a name, because always it's about, the BattleTech lore. And so we're trying to find a name that would, or at least most people who have played BattleTech have heard that name, and they'd be able to connect to it. And so, yeah, at the end of the day, it's not the best sharing of love imaginable. But it's still just a really cool name that people are going to recognize. And so that's why we ultimately chose it.
All the BattleTech fans across the world will cry out, "Please reunify me, Catalyst. Come to my tiny coastal game store and unify
Well,
me."
interestingly enough, there is a little bit of that flavor. And what I mean by that is that we're a huge believer in, you play BattleTech and you read BattleTech and you experience it however you want. You want to play just in 3025? You bet. No worries. You want to play only classic BattleTech and you have no place for Alpha Strike? Awesome. You want to do just Alpha Strike tournaments and don't care about the lore? More power to you. but there is a desire here to ensure that even as you're doing your thing there, you are part of this huge group. That is a part of that, which is why I think the name works, even though, it's got some baggage.
Yeah.
Just to be able to sit and show and make sure that everyone knows. And so then sometimes they might go, maybe I will give the new era a try, or maybe I will
Mhm,
I will give Alpha Strike a try. A lot of people loving that. Maybe I might like it.
mhm.
And just, again, trying to create this feeling across everyone. And obviously, I'm not going to be able to go everywhere, not even close.
You sure are going to a lot of places, though, Randall.
Oh no, I am going to a lot of places. I have never traveled more in my entire life than I have in this last just 6 months, much less the next 6 months. So I can't possibly get everywhere, but I'm hoping with the scale of what I am pulling off, that the community, even if you aren't able to actually meet me and actually shake my hand and get a patch, you can still feel a part of how incredibly awesome this community is.
And that's one of the things, like talking to, we've talked to quite a few different people, completely different, roles in the community and interests and stuff. And everyone loves the community of BattleTech. I think that's, what kept BattleTech going through some of its most difficult times. And so, yeah, it's great to have like Catalyst trying to be a part of that as well. 'Cause the community is what kept this going. It's so varied. It's so welcoming. I think it's a super cool idea.
Yeah, all that.
Catalyst has been actively a part of the community too, right? Obviously, like with, demo agents and all that stuff. Like, I feel like Catalyst has been a really great shepherd for BattleTech. And I've played BattleTech for a long time, but my highest engagement level is now. And from what I've heard from the community in general, it's been some really positive and community oriented focus
like
and
a
interactions.
buzz.
Yeah, the buzz. There's a buzz, man. Yeah.
Well, it's also, I mean, I agree with you. I would like to think, and obviously, you never know unless you ask them on the outside, but I like to think that Catalyst always has been viewed as a part of the community. It is easy when massive success starts happening for a disconnect to happen in both directions, whether intended or not.
Mhm.
And part of the reason for the tour was to ensure that that would not happen, right? That we would all embrace and accept and just feel amazing about the success all together as we all go forward. And the buzz, I mean, you're absolutely right. All you have to do is, go on socials or go on the internet. God, often you don't even have to search for BattleTech, right? If you're just in your gaming feeds or in your geekdom feeds, the amount of BattleTech that now is out there is insane. Just 5 or 6 years ago, to get any type of anything going on was nearly impossible. And now, like every day, on Instagram, I'll see some new posting. Hey, I painted this thing. Isn't this really cool, right?
Yeah.
It's the classic success breeds success, and so it's that the more that there is, and the more that it's shown to be fun and exciting, and the community is amazing, the bigger that's going to be. So, anyone that is a part of this community, just keep doing what you're doing, right? Just keep loving it and sharing it
Mhm.
and showing off what you're doing, and that's just going to bring more and more excitement and more people.
And the diversity of creators that I find in BattleTech, it's crazy. There's people making comics, people podcasts, there's lore-based videos. It just is this huge
Yep.
range. What I like about it is that, you have someone who, what I do is I paint miniatures. And those miniatures, that effort is seen as valuable and is valued as much as podcasts or everything. Everyone brings in a different piece to the puzzle from the community perspective.
Yep.
And it's been really like synergistic.
So just a anecdotal story off that. So speaking of like success breeds success and where BattleTech is at. So Rem, who's our community manager, has done a lot of great work, and just through serendipity and some good calls, suddenly she's connected up with Freddie Prince Jr., who, for those that are old enough to know, was one of the big young actors in the 90s.
The heartthrob in the 90s.
The heartthrob of the 90s, absolutely, right? And for those that have no idea who this is, you might know that he is married to Sarah Michelle Gellar, Buffy. So there's some in there. Well, he played BattleTech way back in the day. He saw the new stuff, liked it, picked it up, started to paint it, and then shared that online. And his comment to us, which a month or two later, because the community was so wonderful and accepting, he's like, I've been a part of a million geek communities. I've never had a community so overwhelmingly embrace and immediately like, oh my gosh, this is looking great here. If you want, this or this or this as possible things that you can do to improve your painting, like it was just, this giant fluffy blanket that embraced him. And because of that, like 2 months later, I'm down in LA teaching him and another group of Hollywoods how to play Alpha Strike because they want to start doing their own streaming show.
Very cool.
That's just crazy that's where BattleTech's at. But again, a wonderful moment where his interaction could have been pretty bad.
Mm-hmm.
And instead it was amazing, right?
Catalyst, the community has done like a great job of cultivating a really positive, welcoming community, treating BattleTech as something for everyone. All sorts of people can engage with it. You can like one piece without liking all the others. You can just like the stompy robots and just play that and never read a piece of lore. And that's perfectly valid.
Yep, absolutely.
And so one thing you touched upon, and I want to dive into it now, is the narrative experience we love in BattleTech. Obviously, that's what's kept you in the experience, and that's what brings me into the experience. And I just feel there's something so narratively special about BattleTech on the table. So when you say that BattleTech is a very narrative system and how it plays out, what do you mean by this? Like, what's your perception to this end?
So, just picking another game, I'm not going to name names, so no one thinks that I'm picking on their game.
Mm-hmm.
But often the mechanics in a game can be incredibly fun. They can be competitive, but everyone at the table knows that it's a game mechanic, right? Like I roll these dice and I got past your armor and I got a critical hit and you lost 3 troopers out of your squad.
Mm-hmm.
I don't often see, and again, having played for a very long time with a lot of places, I don't often then see the person at the table immediately narrating that into a thing that's actually happening at the table. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. I'm sure there's going to be some listeners that are like, oh, I totally do that. And that's awesome. But I don't see it very often. But the reverse then is true, which is I rarely see somebody playing BattleTech who does not have an event happen that doesn't immediately start to narrate it, right? When the arm is blown off, it's this wonderful moment, and almost inevitably, the guy's like, well, I guess I can pick it up and start hammering it with you like a club. Or when the through critical hit happens and you get the double gyro hit. Or even better for me, because my dice always betray me, I can't hit anything. I'll roll 3 times in a row, and all I need is 4s, and I miss every time. And I'm immediately like, oh, that tech is going to get punished. He did not realign my crystals correctly, right? It's that type of thing that I see all the time with BattleTech that I don't see very often with other games. And that's what I mean. And is that because we're just used to it? That's hard to say at this point. It's 40 years old. Or is it that there was something about the way that fiction and lore was placed as the quintessential element of BattleTech that then has trained all of us to think along those lines, to always place what's happening in the board within the framework of the lore. Jordan used to say the same thing, and I've gotten the same thing as well, which is how many times somebody will tell a story, and sure, they will share when they had a good game, but they share more often when they're like, you know what? This game that I had, is when I faced off against Natasha Kerensky on the field of battle, right? So it's less the, oh, I played this fantastic game, and more always in the lore. In fact, I can't remember who I was just talking to, and if they happen to listen to this, I apologize. But they were just talking about how in one of the last games that they played, they were playing and they faced off against Morgan Kell. And then, of course, I'm immediately like, oh, well, you couldn't hit his mech, right? You just turned on the Phantom mech ability, and then we're all laughing. And it's always within a context of the lore that our games unfold. And there's just something about the structure that enables that's just really unique.
And inversely, too, I find that BattleTech players really relish their horrible failures.
Yes.
Because things stack and can become so bad. And as a community, we just embrace that. We embrace this feeling of being stuck on the ground with a broken hip actuator, broken foot, and I just can't move, but I'm so close to extraction. So close.
The one for me is having my Sentinel charge forwards, take a single large laser hit, completely fresh mech, single large laser hit, through armor critical, hits the ammo, mech explodes. In from a tabletop perspective, I was playing a tournament or something, I'd be like, oh man, I just lost, 15% of my battle value. But for me, it's just like the most memorable moment ever. That mech is permanently cursed in my box.
I could not agree more. That and again, to me, that then plays into that we always think of it within the lore framework. And like the story that I always share, you were just you're immediately bringing out your Sentinel story. Well, the story that I always show about the most ludicrous moment ever is we were playing the original Tukian scenario pack all the way back in the early 90s, and my friends and I, it was literally Steve and Flake and Trash, and we played the first 3 or 4 scenarios, and Flake and I were playing the comm guards. And they just walked all over us because, of course, they did with the clans just showing up. But then we got to the 4th scenario, and we're like, oh, we're gonna pay them back, right? This is our moment, and so we got to place some hidden units, and Flake has a king crab in a level 1 water, and the first turn of the game, the Daishi trundles onto the board, and Flake goes to do a point blank attack, and he rises up out of the water, this glorious double AC-20 ready to pound straight into the head of this Daishi, and he fails his piloting skirl, head breach dead.
Hope you brought your scuba gear.
And we literally stood up from the table, and I don't know if we ever went back to the game. Flake wouldn't go in water for like a decade, right? Again, if this was a tournament, if this was another game, that would feel really bad. And instead it felt glorious, and we were laughing our heads off. And now 30 years later, I'm still telling the story. And so, we've gone to a game store where we're there in a game night, and there's a dozen other tables and filled with all these other games, and the BattleTech table is always the one laughing the most. It's just, there's something about it. There's just something in the way it's put together, and it's just really magical, right? I mean, the other thing to think about is you think about all the games you play, right? And all these years that have passed, every single game has endless editions, right? You go over on the role-playing side, Shadowrun's up on its 6th edition, D&D's heading up to its 6th edition as well, on and on and on, and everyone has an endless shift of the rules. Well, BattleTech, at its core, right, when you get to vehicles and infantry, those have been heavily modified. Heck, I've heavily modified them myself, but if you compare a game of armored combat that we put out just a couple years ago with the original 2nd edition box that came out in 1985, I remember Ash Barker from Guerrilla Miniatures Games did a comparison. He loves doing this. And basically he laid it down to maybe a 3% drift in those rulebooks. That's insane. That's never happened anywhere else in our hobby. to have a game in continuous publication, continuous growth, continuous expansions, and everything else, and yet the core of the game remains the same. And so, as much as I like to give Jordan, kick under the table for some of his Dark Age decisions, which he'll be the first to apologize about, he really did create a genius system here. And then the way in which that lore is then plugged in really created something truly special.
And so, is that something you still need to keep in mind as you're working today? Like, is there anything conscious or unconscious that keeps that like narrative element plugged in there?
I think it's always, because we are all fans and because it's the universe itself that we love, it's not that hard to keep that in mind, right? But I would agree that you can never lose, no matter how far afield you may go. Like if you get into the Jihad era, which the tone of the storytelling in the Jihad was probably one of the most radical that we've ever done. And so there's plenty of people that don't like the Jihad. I totally get it. It was a very different era, but we still stayed with the core elements. So the counter to that is you have my story of the two ancillary published products that were massively successful that ultimately self-destructed because they lost sight of that. What I mean by that is, first you had Wizards of the Coast's BattleTech TCG that they published in the late 90s. Massively successful. They sold a ton of that. And they came out with the Arsenal expansion. The Arsenal expansion introduced vehicles. And we had play tested it, and we had told them that the vehicles were too good. And they're like, no, we got this. And it came out, and within like 2 years, maybe, of that expansion's release, the game was dead. And it's because you could immediately make a vehicle deck that would beat any mech deck.
Yeah, the vehicles are super good.
Yeah. So then the next corollary to that is the MechWarrior Dark Age. For those that don't know, back in the early aughts, WizKids published the Clicks game. And once again, initially, it was massively successful. Oh my gosh. And I've run into a ton of people who got into BattleTech through that game on this trip. So it was a thing. It was really big. But then a couple years go by, and vehicles, by the way, were in it from the beginning. But then VTOLs showed up. And I have one of my favorite stories from Rhett, who's somebody who's a coworker of mine all the way back to the FASA days. He was walking around the MechWarrior Dark Age Nationals that were at Gen Con at the time. It was probably 30, 40 tables being played of the game. And Rhett's like, Jordan, what's wrong with him? And it took him a couple of minutes to realize there was not a single mech on the table on any of them. And within a couple of years, Dark Age was dead. And so there are certain key elements. This, by the way, just doesn't apply to BattleTech. When you create a new thing and it gets successful and popular, it's successful and popular for a reason, right? There are core elements that if you drift too far from them, it doesn't matter how good the thing is that you are doing. It is no longer the thing, and that's when you lose your fans. That's when they fall away.
And if it's, just a purely competitive game like Magic the Gathering, I don't think there's that many people who play Magic, a similar Wizards of the Coast card game that would care whether their cards have this picture or that picture. But for BattleTech, I'm here for the big robots.
Yeah, exactly.
So give me those stompy robots.
And so when you introduce things that are more powerful, now I'll be the first one to say, Total Warfare was my baby, and I'm really proud of that. I'm the first one that could show you all the warts that are in it. And one of the warts in it is that I almost made vehicles too good. Now, it takes somebody a lot of effort and a lot of really good knowledge to make it work. And so it didn't quite have the impact of the others. But that's one of those great moments where even I can look back and go, ooh, I almost stepped outside of that key sphere that you cannot go beyond, right?
So one thing I really want to dive into, we all agree that there's this narrative experience in the BattleTech system for a variety of reasons, but I want to brainstorm collectively why we think this is. Like, are there technical elements in the rule base that make it play out this way. And I have thoughts, but I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts first. Randall, if you had to name one thing, when you look at the system from a technical perspective, is there something there that to you brings out this narrative feeling more so than not?
If I had to put my finger on it, it's actually the complexity of the game. I guess I should say like the depth of the design space for it. And what I mean by that is if you pick up most tabletop miniature games, you'll have a little card and it'll have maybe 8, 9 stats on it. And some cards might only have 4 or 5. You have a movement point, you've got an armor, and the armor usually is like 1 or 2, right? Or it might not even be armor, it might just be a breach number that you have to get past. And then most of them have 1 hit. You do 1 point of damage, they're gone. Some of them might have 2 or 3. And so there's not a lot of design space for the feeling of a story that's unfolding. Whereas with BattleTech, because of the wearing away the armor, because the internal structures, because there's body parts that could be torn off, and the fact that it's giant robots, right? It allows for a anthropomorphization that then gets into our psyche, right? Like you're the robot. When the arm is torn off, I've literally seen people at the table when the arm's torn off, and suddenly they're like, I'm gimpy like this, right? And they're flopping their arm around, right? That getting in our heads. And so I would say if there's one thing, it's simply the depth of the design play and the way you interact with it is deep enough to allow us to insert ourselves into it. Whereas most tabletop games, the design space is so thin that trying to force ourselves in there just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel natural. And so then you don't feel the story, and so then you're just having fun and tossing dice. And again, trying really hard to be careful. I play a ton of games. I love them. They're great. They're just different, right?
Yeah, totally.
They don't have that narrative way that BattleTech allows me to. I mean, there's a reason why Jordan, when he created this, did this as modern knights. That I'm a knight climbing up the ladder and sliding into the cockpit and suiting up. And when we sit at the table, we literally can feel ourselves sliding into the cockpit. And it's because the design space allows for that. And then when the lore constantly reinforces it, right? Like all the aspects of the lore then reinforce this thought process. And when I sit down to a table, and when I'm grabbing the dice, I'm actually grabbing a joystick, right? I'm aligning the gun. All those things work really well in ways that just are really unique in our industry.
Yeah, that's really interesting. About talking about like how like the scale, even though they're 75-ton mechs as tall as a 2-story building, the fact that it is like a person in a big person-shaped robot gives it some like tactile sense. And yeah, like some of my favorite games have been where I'm not even commanding a lance. I'm commanding a mech in a lance with other people at the table.
Yeah, absolutely.
It works as a game at that scale. It works as a game at a bigger scale.
Well, and that shared community, right? That we're all thinking the same thing. We have the same thoughts going through our head. The fact that the same jokes can unfold at the table. These are all that self-referential reinforcing. And then it's a good dopamine hit that we're like, I made this joke and it was an in-universe joke, and they got it. We all laughed and had a great time, right? That's all really powerful.
Some great moments where I'm on a lance with someone, and I watch them take some big hits or something, and they're like, oh no, I got it covered. Their mech jumps away, and they're hiding behind a mountain, and I'm hung out to dry, getting hammered by the enemy.
Yep.
There is a sort of like a feel at the table. Like I'm not going to tell that person they're playing wrong. Like it fits really well with how the fight is unfolding. It just feels cool, even as I'm, watching my armor, plink away.
Even as you're dying. Yeah, and that wearing away, right? So that yes, there is the Gauss shot across the table. In fact, the game I just played in Salt Lake, this 10-year-old kid had a heavy Gauss rifle headshot kill and then a Gauss headshot kill, right? Like everyone at the table was terrified of him. So we're all going to get those. And we all remember those as these glorious things. But the vast majority of the time, it's this wonderful breaking down and this wearing away, and it allows us then to have that emotional connection, that it's not one die roll and I just took 3 of my minis off the table,
Yeah.
right?
And that was actually going to be my thing for like part of what makes it fit so well narratively for me is when you look at you've got these are machines that are being picked apart and absorbing blows, and that's what they're built for, but also they're being torn to pieces bit by bit. And like even the way like the sheet is laid out, like it looks more like a technical readout, and being able to cross out those boxes in different areas as the armor vaporizes. Yep. Like it feels like a real thing. The mechs feel real, even though it's all made up rules and all fantasy stuff. But
so I'll share one of the more geekier things I've ever done in my life here, just because it plays into it. And usually when I tell this story, either they don't believe me or they're like, I can't believe you got away with that. So I'm a junior year in English class, at least for my age, and I don't know if it's still happening now. It was, you spend a whole semester putting together a paper that you have to then document it all, and we had the flashcards with all the footnotes and all this stuff, and everyone else is working away, and I'd already been a month in the semester, and I'm like, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm at the library and can't figure anything out, so of course I pull out my 3025 that of course I kept in my backpack at all times, and was just starting to read, because that's what you do.
That's what the cool kids
and
do, Randall.
Suddenly it struck me, that's exactly, particularly in the 1980s. Yes.
Check out this cool book.
Check out this cool book that I swear is not from the devil. Yes, that's exactly what the 1980s were like.
It's robots. So, robots can't be devil.
That's right. So there's no devils in here. No satanic panic, please. But I suddenly had this crazy idea, and our English teacher was awesome. He's one of those that gave the kids his phone number that you could call him if you needed some help. So I call him and I'm like, okay, so am I allowed to do a paper on anything? And he's like, well, what do you mean by that? Well, he's like, I want to propose that X is better than Y, and we should be doing X, not Y. And he's like, well, is there published product that you could quote, like books and stuff? And I'm like, why, yes, there is. And so my English paper was how battle mechs were a superior military vehicle to ground vehicles. And I wrote the whole thing up, and I got a B+ on it, and I would have gotten an A on the oral, except no matter how hard I tried, because again, you got to set yourself way back in the geek machine. And geekdom now is everywhere and is imbued everywhere. But at that time, man, no geekdom anywhere except, the tiny little niches that we were in. And so the members in the class were just staring at me like I was insane. They had no idea what I was talking about. I literally had the blueprint. I literally had the old-fashioned blueprints on the wall as I'm giving my oral discussion.
Oh, man.
It's totally insane, but I got a B+ on both that and the oral, and I believe I still have that somewhere on my shelf. But that just goes back to what you're talking about. It feels real. And so I was able to do a whole paper and even discuss to people because it feels real. And that's just, that is, I would totally agree that is a key part of it.
And there's so many like content creators in that space that, just make their whole thing is just talking about like as though these were real machines.
I know. I love that to death. Like the fact that basically I was a teenage version of Tex, though his voice is 10,000 better than mine, right? That just makes me laugh my head off. That now he can have a whole video and gets 100,000 views for this type of thing. That's fantastic. I love that.
It's funny. I was talking to Keith Hahn about this the other day, and I mentioned that earlier before we started recording, Randall, but actually the reason why he thinks BattleTech has narrative is exactly what you said. Like the granularity, the specificity, how it tells a very, very clear story. My perspective is slightly different, and it might have to do with my brain's ability to comprehend things in general, which seems to be like a constant problem. But to me,
little Roadrunner action then going on here.
exactly. The fact that the BattleTech system uses simultaneous resolution, to me, because so much is happening, and it's not as simple as A, then B, then C, then D, then E. It's like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all happening at once. And then, the other letters all happening at once. Because it works in sort of stages like that, it forces my brain to understand it through a story. So when everything's happening, I automatically see the stage. I see the battle happening. And from that comes the narration. I see someone running forward and someone runs where he just was. But because it's simultaneous, technically they're like weaving around each other, right? Like there's so much going on.
Yep.
You see the intensity, the skills of the pilots and all that stuff. So that's, I think, one of the core elements. And also, Keith made a joke about this in the Battle Mech manual. I think it's regarding the armor that is stronger against autocannons or standard munitions. And it's something like, finally, the reign of autocannons has come to an end. Sort of making fun of the fact that mechanically in the system, autocannons are not as good as other stuff. But when you have that in a system, though, that to me is powerful. When you're saying that, sometimes you're going to have weapons and systems that are not as good as other weapons. If you only look at it from a competitive angle, it doesn't make sense. But if you look at it from a narrative angle, this is the universe. There are inherent imbalances. It just makes everything make so much sense.
I totally agree with you. I can remember being a young kid, falling in love with BattleTech and playing, and reaching a point where I looked at design and I could go, this design sucks. Why would anyone make this design? And then it took another year or two for me to get old enough to realize that sucky things are made all the time.
Yeah.
Just to pick one of the most obvious ones, like the Osprey, one of the most boondoggled airplane VTOL crafts ever made. And it was basically made by a committee, and that's how things get made sometimes. Mm-hmm. And so you're right. It may, once again, it's that it feels real. I can look at a design and I can feel. Actually, I think the moment when I realized that, it's the 3050 tech readout had come out, and the Panther had an ERPPC on it, and it had only single heatsink. And you're looking at this going, that is the stupidest thing ever. And then you read it up and you realize, well, at that moment in time, the Combine could not produce double heat sinks fast enough. And so they had to decide where they were going to place them, and they would put them in their assault mechs. And that was just kind of this mind-blowing thing where I could go, wow, the game embraces lesser and less optimum because it feels more real in the universe. That was one of those magical moments that I can look back on and just go, yeah, that's right. That's the glory that is BattleTech.
Now you're not, intentionally crippling yourself by playing a suboptimal option.
Exactly.
You're just playing something in the universe. You know, you're the unfortunate victim of poor military procurement policies.
Exactly, right? That story, again, the story immediately writes itself. And then what ends up happening is you want to overcome that challenge. It's not a game mechanic at the table. No, you are a warrior on a world who cannot get the right procurement. How do you fight a battle when that pirate raid comes in, when you don't have the right resources? Well, now it's a challenge. Now it's, I can do this. I can be there for my soldiers. I can be there for this world. And when you pull it off, then suddenly that's the story you're telling for years.
Yeah.
I friggin' love my blackjacks. I run just classic BJ ones all the time. And everyone kind of laughs at it.
Because it's a terrible design. I mean, the funniest thing about the blackjack is like we actually ended up putting the blackjack in as one when we did our first mercenary themed force pack, the Wolfstrigan's force pack. There's a blackjack variant in there, which we never would have done in a million years, except the BattleTech computer game from Harebrained Schemes, once again embracing that you get kind of sucky stuff when you're at the back end of nowhere, made one of the first mechs you have a blackjack. And now suddenly there's a whole generation of people that love the blackjack. And so then we're like, well, I guess that's going in that pack because, we want to support that.
And then again, that totally loops back around into the lore. The blackjack, it wasn't a great mech. It wasn't supposed to be a great mech, but it was a mass-produced mech.
But
there are a lot of MechWarriors who got their starts in blackjacks. They still love them.
And it does look cool. This has been super cool. Man, yeah, I've learned a lot about the different narrative perspectives. And it sounds like, honestly, so much of your blood is narrative. We're seeing that, we're feeling that in the system. So this has been super interesting to dive into, and I'm excited to move on to our next segment.
He reads the books and the spreadsheets.
I do it all. Absolutely.
This is Professor Michael presenting The Sphere We Live In. The Maskirovka, striking fear into the hearts of Lao's enemies, both within Capella and abroad. They are known as one of the most effective intelligence agencies in the sphere, but what of their history? How did they become so entwined with Capellan culture and authority? Legendarily secretive and loyal, information on the Maskirovka is sparse and guarded, but its history can be traced back to before the fall of the Star League. The Maskirovka was originally established to investigate and clean up Demosis, the Capellan intelligence agency at the time. In fact, the Maskirovka was so effective at removing disloyal and inept officials that Demosis ceased to exist. Fortunately, the Maskirovka was able to step up and protect Capella, quickly expanding its scope to provide the now missing military intelligence services, as well as monitoring and security for domestic affairs. Now you know about the sphere we live in.
Secondary objective, rule check discovery segment. Initiating.
Welcome back, everybody, to our rule check discovery segment. And today, yes, I know you were hoping for this as soon as you found out we had Randall as a guest. You want to know what rule mistake he's made. And I tell you, man, woo! This is an abstract, fun one. So, Randall, please explain what you were doing when you started the game.
Well, as a quick aside, this game is big enough and has enough pieces that, I make little mistakes here and there all the time, right? Like I was just at Pastor Games and they were asking a question about stealth armor and I'm like, oh, it's a +2 and a +4. And one of the players is like, are you sure? And I'm thinking, And so then I go up and I'm thinking, you know what? I think that was an old edition of the rules where I realized that was broken. Those little things, that's going to happen to anyone. But what they're referring to is when you do something that's a much bigger and you do it persistently for a while. When we first started playing, again, I'm 15 at the time. I've never remotely played a game this big or this complex before. And so reading the rules, we read it. And part of it, I think, looking back, was probably just the speed. Like we were just so wanting to play that the pain of having to actually read every word didn't allow us to read every word. So we were probably just skimming. But ultimately, the way we decided the rules were for heat is that you instantaneously apply the modifiers and then you take the heat away so that the modifiers wouldn't be there on a subsequent turn if you'd taken the heat away. So I fire my PPC, I get 10 heat. That is immediately, the -2 for a walk, a +1 to hit. That had to be applied straight up. So we must have played that way for 6 months. And suddenly maybe we're rereading it again, who knows what. And somebody at the table was like, you realize we've been doing this wrong. Now, it sounds silly, but really talking to any of our original group that played that way, we ultimately loved it because then it didn't make us afraid of heat. I've played and seen a lot of people play that they'll get 5 or 6 heat and have an immediate -1 movement, and they're immediately talking about a whole bunch of heat that they're carrying. Whereas for our group, nothing happens till 14, right? And so I run between 15 and 20 heat quite often if the design needs it, and that, it's a resource, use it.
Mhm.
If I read rules now that had me doing that, I would think it was wrong. You would know it was wrong because of how much, a game shouldn't punish you that much. But being that young kid and the inexperience, I'm like, oh, well, it's written, so this must be what it is. So yeah, that's probably one of the most ludicrous mistakes I've ever heard anyone make with BattleTech.
Yeah, I can sort of see how it like makes sense. Like if I picture myself a few years ago before I got into tabletop, when you shoot the weapon, that's when you get the heat. And then the heat bleeds off over
Exactly.
time. Yeah, it makes sense.
Right?
But also it'd be like a pain to bookkeep, and like putting it all in one phase sort of makes sense.
Yeah, not only that, but it's punishing, right? It's actually not fun to play a game like that. I've played plenty of games where you can see that the designers were trying for something really cool, but they kind of forgot that it's still a game and should be fun. And so it was unnecessarily painful. Whereas you want the pain points to be decisions that the player gets to make. Am I going to give myself this pain point? That's where the magic is. And BattleTech has that in spades, right? Just some of the stories we were sharing earlier of, I'm going to jump into the middle of this fight, or I'm going to leave the fight, or I am going to massively overheat myself, and all the things that are going to come with that. Those are decisions that the players get to make.
And so just so I understand, Randall, the granularity in which you are applying this, because if we're shooting all our weapons and the heat sort of soaks up right there and excess heat would impact further phases, it's not going to impact the physical phase unless like certain outliers like physical defense movement mode or stuff like that.
Correct.
Did it matter which weapon order you fired? So, for example, I fire my PPC. Let's use the Panther example. I fire my ER PPC with the Panther. I go up 15 heat. I only have 10 heat sinks, so I sink 10. I already have 5. And then let's say I have 2 medium lasers, whatever. I can't think of an actual example. But then I get myself up. I fire the next one. I have 3 heat. Now I'm at 8 heat. Now I have a +1 to hit. Would that impact the next medium laser I fire in the same phase? Is that how granular you were taking it?
I don't believe it was that ridiculous.
Okay.
I believe what it was just the next turn.
Okay.
And so yeah, the way you're describing it, I don't believe I had the play chops to understand that a game could be that ridiculous, right? That it could be that granular. And instead it was just I fire the PPC and the 2 medium lasers. That's 21 heat. I've only got the 10 heat sinks. I've got 11 that's applied. The 21 is applied immediately. So all those effects will now happen in turn 2. And then
maybe I drop unconscious right now.
Exactly, right? And then the 10 heat sinks take it away. And so I'm carrying 11.
Maybe all your mechs just had really inefficient cooling systems. They had like, just like oily.
At the time he was playing, it's true, right? Yeah.
I was going to say, speaking of that procurement officers, they really
they forgot
poorly
to fill my
underwrote us. That's right. I will say though, anyone who doesn't like or is kind of a little fearful of heat, honestly, play a game that way and it will cure you real fast.
How many things would this impact? Does it impact everything we think? Like obviously there's some advanced rules it impacts for sure. It impacts some weapons, but because I'm not seeing how. Because if we get rid of the heat straight away,
if I fire all of my weapons, I might just drop unconscious, even if I have 70 heat sinks on my weird mutant panther.
Ammo explosions. So when
there we go.
When I fire the PPC and the 2 medium lasers, I'm at 21 heat, which means the ammo explosions and shutdown happens right then.
Okay, now I understand.
The heat sinks are applied. And by the way, I've never, in all the years of doing this and all the discussions like this I've had, I've never found a single other group that played it like that, which is a good thing because it was ludicrous, but it does make it a pretty unique thing.
I have to ask if you were brave enough at this time period to try to fight with Inferno missiles.
I don't think Infernos came up until we had actually figured that out. Because you're right, if then that would have been crazy, right? But no, I'm pretty sure by the time we really started getting into that type of thing, we had figured out that we were playing it wrong and then it fixed it.
Super cool.
Well, I, for one, think that energy weapon users have had it too good for too long, and that this chain would be good for
It's a narrative decision, Michael.
We could talk ad nauseum, as I have done, about some of the things that have transpired to make energy weapons just so much better than ballistic weapon. But that's maybe bring me on in another couple of months and we'll talk about that for an hour.
We need like a special segment like Randall's Corner. We can play like
that'd be awesome.
Like have like a fire sound effect in the background, like sitting.
Nice. Today, the presenter Marshall brings you straight from Terra. Yeah. So, unfortunately, I'm incredibly glad I was able to get this in. But yeah, this is everyone who knows me will say that I'm a total workaholic. But even for me, this year is turning out to be somewhere in Europe a couple of weeks ago. I'm like, man, what did I sign up for, right? So, but no, loving it to death, and maybe I can come back on, but it may need to be in a couple of months.
Of course, and you know what? Totally appreciate you taking the time today, and honestly, conversation's been really inspiring, and what an insane rule mistake. Oh my god, I love it so much. I love it so much.
I know, it's so ridiculous.
I'm just imagining all your, mechs around the table shooting a bunch of weapons and then just exploding.
Just exploding before anything happens. Well, let's start the next game, I guess.
So for people that decide to play that rule of Randall, I also suggest that you play our party game rule of the strip heat management that Michael and I proposed like months ago. Those will combine really well. Okay, well, Randall, thank you so much for your time, for your wisdom, and for your generosity being here.
You are most welcome. This was so much fun. Appreciate it.
This is Professor Michael presenting The Sphere We Live In. The Lowen Green are among the most dangerous branches within the already formidable Lyran Intelligence Corps. As an anti-terrorist unit, they are aggressive, brutal, and often credited with the low number of attacks in Lyran space. Among similar agencies, they are known for their extremely high kill rate, as well as their extremely high casualty rate. Their efficacy is often attributed to their unique training. Lowen Green units are paired with and train alongside LIC's Loki terror cells. There is substantial overlap in combat and infiltration skills shared between the two groups, whether launching or protecting against terrorist attacks. It also gives new members of the branch an opportunity to witness the damage these types of attacks can do to the Lyran worlds and civilian populations. Thanks to this unique training program, the Lowen Green are among the most effective and patriotic anti-terror units in the sphere. Now you know about the sphere we live in.
Tertiary objective, Stories of the Inner Sphere segment. Initiating.
Star League High Council Chamber, Unity City, Puget Sound, North America, Terra, 26 May 3151. The gong of the massive clock in the hallway struck, announcing the passing of midnight. It echoed down still ruined corridors, now mostly silent, a benediction to a day unlike any day in the history of the clans. Sa Khan Paterkalasa stood uncomfortably next to his Khan, on a balcony just outside the newly restored Star League High Council chamber. The first small areas of Unity City to be returned to their former glory. Gravity always feels so wrong. Oh, he paid the price to be groundside when needed. Fighting in his battle mech, negotiations and so on, but it didn't change that near such a large celestial body as a planet, gravity just felt wrong. Do you think the Founders really foresaw this day? Better spoke, breaking the quiet reverie. What? Con Morihawker responded, still gazing out into the wonder of dense woodlands that stretched for hundreds of kilometers in nearly every direction. Did Nicholas Kerensky actually have a plan for what happens when a clan seizes Terra and becomes the Ill Clan? Did he see beyond this day, or was the act of striving for this day all that mattered for his nascent clans all those centuries ago? Con Hawker slowly turned to look at him, his frumpy elderly features hiding a keen intelligence that had allowed him to seize the conship decades earlier, and even survive an insurrection and attempted assassination within the clan. That sounds close to blasphemy. Better snorted, running a hand across his head, the heavy scars and bald pate on the right side now as natural to him as breathing. Please. We are not the Falcons to stand on such semantics. Besides, look where it got them. Their clan nearly annihilated. Melvina's Mongol doctrine in disgrace. No, I was simply wondering. We have forged the Ill Clan and crowned the Ill Khan. Did our founder ever really expect this day to come? Or was it a vision that strengthened and drove us for all these years? The other man shrugged, turning back to the verdant growth that settled the scenes of pine and fecundity throughout the region. Does it matter? Not particularly. Besides, we did not crown a Khan. He seized it by right of combat. Semantics again. For over 300 years, nothing in the clans has been permanent. Always a new trial could change the currents. Always one at the bottom could seize a rung up, and those at the top could always misstep, falter. Until now, we witnessed and affirmed the ascension of Clan Wolf to Ill Clan for all time. Nothing can ever change that. Or can it? He stretched his neck uncomfortably as other thoughts swam in deep currents. Silence greeted the statement as a cool wind redolent with brine swept over the two men, ruffling hair and uniforms, while the hoot of a hunting owl floated on the night air. Glancing up, Petter noticed a heavy cover of clouds and wondered if it would rain soon. And so you believe all is settled? Con Hawker finally responded, turning to meet his eyes once more. He waved his hand, shaking his head in annoyance. A younger me would have snarled even at the Khan for missing my meaning. He absently touched his scars, but not now. Of course not. Alaric has achieved the dream of 100 generations of warriors, but his perch is precarious. The rocks jagged, the current deep and fast all around. Exactly. He has conquered Terra, but he cannot leave so many nearby worlds unconquered. He will need to quickly swallow adjacent worlds to start creating a buffer, regardless of the damnable wall. Petter nodded. And the Raff remnants will try and make him choke on such ambitions. Precisely. They will be out for revenge for the destruction of their Republic of the Sphere and the death of their Messiah. And of course, they pale next the Draconis Combine and Capellan Confederation. If I was Alaric, I would be trying to carve out a full jump cordon around Terra, which means what? 5 worlds from House Lau? Petter brought up a mental interstellar map of the Terran corridor. Endless years of travel and trade coming to the fore. 6. Gon Hawker acknowledged the correction easily. And Dao Shen will fanatically hold on to every crumb he has grubbed back from a half-millennium of countless losses for his realm. Petter nodded, but a new thought surfaced. If Denai were to assume the throne, a more amicable resolution would likely be found. House Lao is more powerful than they have been in centuries. What are a few worlds ceded to an ascendant wolf empire if it comes with some new and powerful strings attached? Perhaps new trade status?
Which you would be happy to ensure.
We are Sea Fox.
Hawker nodded. After those Capellan worlds, there are 5 Combine worlds.
Including Dairon.
His Khan chuckled darkly. Especially including Dairon. I would loathe having that world on my doorstep, but kicking the Combine back off that rock will prove exceedingly difficult.
Perhaps not as difficult as imagined, Petter replied as he pulled on strings of his own endless speculations, always looking for new markets and possibilities. Toranaga has accomplished much, nearly shattering the armed forces of the Federated Suns with the help of the Unity Pact with House Lao, but they are stretched thin. Perhaps they cannot hold on to Dairon when they have such long supply lines pushed into the Federated Suns.
Hawker slowly nodded, eyes hooded for his own internal lists of ploys and counterploys. Nova Cats, he said softly.
Petter winced. Well, he'd never held with their trappings of visions. Seeing a clan fall, even an abjured one, was never a thing a clansman could look upon without a shudder. But for luck, there go I. And made all the more tragic being at the hands of the Combine that had treated the clan so terribly for decades. But the threads his Khan saw wafted from the deep, and Petter nodded at the audacity. Alaric has made noises of punishing the dragon for daring to kill a clan.
Exactly.
And even if he does not go through with it, the threat could be enough to rattle the dragon into blinking.
Especially if he is able to insinuate that as the Ill Khan of the Ill Clan, he now commands the loyalty of the Bears and the Ravens.
Correct. The remnants of the Wolves may be some of the finest warriors currently in the Inner Sphere after the Cauldron of Terra, but they are only a shadow army. But a stretched dragon between the might of the Rasselhog Dominion and Raven Alliance? That might just be enough to back them off and concede Dairon and a few other worlds. To hold the peace, or whatever tripe they come up with to justify the concession. Ironic, Petter mused. That is essentially what Stone did when he formed the Republic.
He pulled in another breath, so filled with sense that nearly overwhelmed the senses more than gravity.
That's assuming that either the Bears or Ravens would commit to such a massive conflict.
Hawker's lips twitched with humor as he glanced at Petter. Petter, Salkon, are you saying that 2 clans would immediately disobey the very vows of loyalty we just heard them speak this night?
Petter struggled to keep his own humor in check. I believe that no matter what the Ghost Bear Khans say, they cannot speak for their entire dominion. They answer to a civilian council. They place that harness on themselves. They are a wild card that could play in a half-dozen gambits, much less what the other Khans might do if push comes to shove. As such, Ilkhan Ward is astute enough to not test the limits of such new loyalty. At least, not for a while.
Hawker nodded. Exactly. But the illusion is all that is needed, not the reality. Can he convince the Combine of that?
Petter cocked his head. Perhaps if the Dominion gave up Yore, and even Imbros III, it would buy him that illusion.
Perhaps. But are the Bears willing to give him such cover? You never know with them.
Petter nodded. They always wait patiently, and then surge in their own direction as they have since the founding.
It paid to not be in the Bears' way when they moved. Alric's next move could be toward Tharkat.
Hawker spoke, words jerking Petter into interesting new currents.
His wolf empire sits right on that doorstep, and he came so close last time.
His blood ties mean he has a claim to their throne, despite any repudiations. And Trillian Steiner is a bauble that will be seized soon enough by a Lyran noble tired of her infectual rule. Peter nodded, reaching out a hand to touch the cold metal balustrade of the balcony, sending tiny shivers along his arms. The collapse of the Jade Falcon occupation zone will quickly give rise to new powers and new opportunities. A noble that can carve out a significant swath of territory can return to Tharkat a person of action and strength. Precisely. It would be a very strong move. Better continued, but also perhaps the most expected, especially since the conquest of the Falcon worlds will take time. Too many powers feeding at the same trough. Wars there will be quick and vicious. Alaric needs to be very careful to not do the expected if he wants to keep the forces arrayed against him off balance. Speaking of which, what of your pet protectorate in the League?
Petter easily swam in his Khan's rapidly shifting streams of thought.
There are so many factors at play in the League, as always, my Khan. Nicole Merrick continues her mother's ambitions of crafting a whole Free Worlds League once more. And while not as bereft as the Jade Falcon worlds, the Wolf Empire is an empty shell, ready to crack at the right provocation. Conflicts will always be swift and brutal as opportunists seek to savage the wolves in their weakness. In fact, part of my purpose in coming here was to inform you that I'm departing for the Protectorate. Quickly. Now that our primary tasks of ferrying supplies and enabling better communications for the wolves are in abeyance with the conquest of Terra, I need to be hands-on if I will impact future developments in the League.
And will you help the Wolf Empire? I imagine Alaric would expect such, especially after I acknowledge my support for his ascendants.
Though Petter knew they were alone, he chose his words as though Alaric were listening. You can never be too careful. He absently brushed his scars in a habitual remembrance of unintended consequences. Clan Wolf is the ill clan. Clan Seafox will ensure that the future sees their star is ultimately ascendant. Khan Hawker's lips settled into a small smile as he glanced his way once more.
You are truly becoming the Sea Foxman I knew you could be. Find the currents that will make us strong.
Petter bowed his head in honest fealty. Selah, my Khan. May the currents make you strong. He swept off the balcony and back down the corridor, feet anxious to be free of this gravity well. Clan Seafox Arkship Poseidon, Zenith Jump Point, Terra, Wolf Empire, 3 June 3151. Petter luxuriated in the weightlessness. Sarkhan, Killa spoke, crashing against his moment of respite. He managed to keep annoyance from his voice. He still struggled now and then, and opened his eyes to find his aide waiting patiently and attentive at the door of his office. He did let a sigh go. Then, accepting the weight of responsibility that supplanted gravity as he reached down and grabbed the edge of his desk, expertly jackknifed down into the chair behind it, the microfibers of his suit easily adhering to the seat and back. Yes, he responded once he was situated and fully reoriented away from the few moments he had taken for himself. You wanted to be informed when the ship is ready to jump. He waved his hand across his desk, bringing near space to life in meticulous 3D projected detail. Terra's Zenith Jump Point was still awash with jump ships, and some few warships, the aftermath of such a massive invasion. But the numbers were ebbing as resources were diverted and new commands given. You were there. He didn't look up from the display, but her tone spoke of her urgency. I was there when Alaric was named the Ilkhan. Then you will support him, as we discussed. Of course I will support him, as will Con Hawker.
Better heard a long sigh, and just kept from gritting his teeth, especially as his emotions twisted from frustration to melancholy.
You wield your sighs as Jessup did his sarcasm.
He still felt the loss of his previous aide, despite the passing of more than 15 years since he'd been forced to kill him.
You doubt my ability?
He did glance up then, taking in her small stature, short hair, like most sea foxes. She didn't wish to mess with it during so much zero-gravity life, but eyes that cut as sharp as Jessup's tongue.
I would never doubt your ability, my Sakon. In fact, perhaps I doubt your inability to not use your full abilities.
He shrugged at the backhanded compliment, leaning back into the chair, feeling the microfibers bunch and move to keep him secured.
Why do all of my aides seem to tread the same ground over and over? Because your tracks are well worn in the circles you navigate.
He smiled, glad at how easy it was to not bristle at such words, as it would have been for so much of his life before. He touched his scars.
Con Hawker has formally given his support for the Ilklan, but you believe he will lockstep too much with the Ilkhan. I have the utmost respect for Con Hawker,
and he meant it.
But you are right. If opportunities arise to empower Clan Seafox, I will of course ensure those streams are forded. Even if it costs Clan Wolf.
He cocked his head.
I was very clear with Con Hawker. I will ensure their star is ultimately ascendant.
Killa cocked her head in return.
Ultimately.
He smiled larger, despite her constant pushing that she instantly saw to the heart of the matter proved why she was his aide. He would never tell her that he wanted that pushing.
You have paid a terrible price for such nuanced thinking,
she said. His smile fell from his face, and the ire ratcheted as his hand brushed his scars.
Do not push too far, Killa. I brought much glory to Delta Ameg and now to Spina Khanate, and have paid the price. Others have paid more.
He breathed deeply, wanting to lash out, realizing the foolishness of not accepting that truth.
An Ovkhan can be so blind, not a Sakon.
He nodded purposefully in her direction.
That is why I have you at my side, Killa.
The silence stretched as an electronic voice spoke the length of the ship, announcing an imminent jump.
I only hope I can keep up with you, my Sakon,
she finally said. His smile returned, wider than ever. Clan Seafox Arc Ship Poseidon, Natter Point, Talitha, Unaligned Worlds, 12th June 3151. The trader materialized in the holodeck of the massive bridge of the Poseidon. Petter, floating in the chair just above the command deck, took in the woman's short red hair, strong chin, and bold eyes, along with the LFTA patch riding on her single suit's chest, as well as the details gleaned from a close flyby of the merchant-class jump ship, and seized the initiative. It is good to see a Lyran free trader expanding their options. Though the deep can be filled with sharks, it can also bring bounty. The woman nodded, her accent thick but intelligible.
If you do not seize the moment, another will. The universe has changed overnight, I hear.
He smiled. Even with so few operating HPGs and a paucity of jump ships, rumors would swirl. Rumors always find a way. Speaking of which, what rumors do you bring?
What rumors do you bring?
She shot back, Whether real or feigned, her confidence shone brightly. Considering the size of her jump ship next to the massive bulk of his arc ship, that spoke volumes. Not to mention, he wanted the news flying, so he conceded first. The rumors are true. There is an ill clan on Terra. I personally witnessed the investiture. Ilkhan Alaric Ward controls the cradle of humanity.
And humanity as well.
He shrugged nonchalantly. We are but humble traders. That is for others to decide. She laughed until she bent over, dashing tears from her eyes that haloed her head lazily.
Clan Sea Fox just simple traders? More like kingmakers.
Exactly. You have my rumors. What rumors from you? She nodded slowly as she regained control, as though to say, you didn't disavow my statement.
League forces have struck into the Wolf Empire.
His pulse quickened, but Petter remained carefully relaxed. And you have come from League space. I thought you were down from Steiner worlds.
I've come from Wolf Empire territory, straight from Gina.
He raised an eyebrow, his estimation rising. And you saw this directly? She shook her head.
No, but a trader I've worked with for decades saw it. I trust him implicitly.
Who? Duchy of Tamarind Abbey? Covenant Worlds? The League proper? She abashedly shook her head.
Unlike your morsel, neither I nor he saw it directly, only the aftermath. But his instincts are always true. As war finishes with terror, it comes to the Empire.
He instinctively knew it for truth, quicker even than I imagined, and will need to speed up my travel. Petter grimaced momentarily, as a thought of double gravities when traveling to planets and the dangers of redline charging of KF drives. Regardless, she fell slightly in his eyes for failing to verify the rumor personally. I am feeling generous this day, but note that the next time we meet, the balance is shifted in my favor. I will collect. For the first time, a shadow of trepidation wormed onto her visage. She nodded, gravely.
The next time we meet, you will be repaid in full, and more.
He breathed the wonderfully stale sense of shipboard life as he tapped a button on his chair to cancel the projection. He turned, finding Killa at his elbow. I trust the rumor. She immediately spoke, but softly, to only carry to his ears. I agree, he muttered back, mulling over the possibilities. Of course, he would need to deal with Ricard and Juliet in their clan protectorate, but new options arose. I believe we need to visit the Covenant World's capital. She slowly nodded as she aptly leapt to keep up with him. You can find out if they are involved, or see if they wish to be involved. Oh, they wish to be involved. I can smell it from 30 light years away. But they are likely hesitant, as they have been in the past. We need to ensure they are not so hesitant in just the right way. Though concern mirrored in her eyes, she nodded again, seeing the opportunities too large to miss. This has been a sample reading of Deep Currents found in Empire Alone. It was written by our guest today, Randall Bills. Make sure to check out Empire Alone for the sick conclusion to this story. And that, my BattleTech pals, brings us to an end of another deployment of BungleTech. Thank you, as always, for piloting along with us on the journey. As our always reminder, you can find us via Discord, email, Twitter, and now Patreon, all linked in the description. And to all our current patrons, your support bolsters us like Endo Steel Frames bolsters Mech Chassis. In closing,
I'm happy to share some words of wisdom from our patron MechWarrior Metal Ed that seem especially pertinent based on our conversation with Randall today. Ahem. The rule I find players failing to follow the most lately can be found in Empire Alone on page 116. It states, remember the 2 prime directives of playing BattleTech. 1. Have fun. 2. Don't let yourself get so caught up in the rules that you stop having fun. If you're ever looking around the game table and see people not having fun because of something that can be changed, change it. We've a saying on the demo team, there is no right way to play BattleTech. I would like to add a corollary. The only wrong ways to play BattleTech are the ones where people aren't having fun. Well said. Until next time, MechWarriors. Good fortunes on the battlefield. Selah.
All podcast objectives complete. Podcast shutdown sequence initiated.